differs from a lot of other documents is the way that we identify alternatives or identify criteria and use those criteria consistently. So to start with then, the really important part of evaluating alternatives is identifying those criteria. And to do that, we need to go back to the background research that we do at the start of a business case to get into the importance of various parts of the organization, its mission, vision, and values, the mandates or specific directions that have been articulated in things like strategic plans. All those kinds of things are really key places to go for finding things that are important and enough to be considered criteria to evaluate. I think also, as mentioned, the stakeholder engagement is critical in this part as well. It's not just about identifying alternatives that may meet stakeholders' needs. It's about identifying the things that stakeholders think are important when deciding what course of action to take in response to a problem or opportunity. So, decision makers are obviously important too, because ultimately the business case is a recommendation that can be accepted or not by the decision makers. But the inclusion of stakeholders in the process of identifying criteria is, I think, a part that's often overlooked. So having that stakeholder engagement and including the evaluation or the identification of criteria to be evaluated as part of that stakeholder engagement plan is a critical component of this whole part of the business case process. So again, the goal here is to identify criteria that can be used to identify or to measure across all alternatives. We're not looking to create a set of measurements for one alternative and use a different flavor of those measurements elsewhere. We're looking for the same criteria that will be measured in the same way and can be used across all alternatives in the business case process. And then I think I know that there are probably some private sector folks in this meeting as well. There are many, many more books and documents written about private sector business case processes. In the public sector, there's a little bit less. So I think it's an important reminder that in the public sector, it's not all about money. Yes, money is critically important. Budget makes the world go round. But there are things like citizen trust, the view of effectiveness of government, things like that are very difficult to quantify in terms of dollars. So, yes, we want to look at how much things cost and try to find ways to, reduce the budget needed to do things administratively and all of that. But don't necessarily feel pressured to monetize everything in the same way that you might as part of a cost benefit analysis. At a minimum, considering criterion for evaluation of alternatives in the cost, risks, benefits, and requirements categories, I think is really important. So, it's really difficult to do anything without addressing cost. It's also difficult to do things without addressing the benefits that you're intending to achieve through a particular course of action. So taking those into account, is kind of part of that traditional cost benefit analysis. But as part of the alternatives identification and the identification of the problem or opportunity in the business case, we also have identified a set of minimum requirements to address the problem or opportunity. And it's important to include those in the evaluation criteria as well. And then it's very difficult to quantify risk, in part because risk is the reduction of risk is something we're hoping doesn't happen. So we're hoping that risks are not realized and that we are reducing them. So there are things that are not intending to happen in the future. It's difficult to measure that, especially since the absence of something is difficult to successfully attribute to a particular cause in a lot of cases. So risk can be an interesting one, but you want to consider the ways that your potential alternatives will diminish risks that the organization is aware of. or that the organization may want to mitigate through a particular course of action. So options for costs, always consider implementation costs. And then I think this is the most important part to identify for a time frame. So, your ongoing maintenance and support costs are critical to any project or any initiative that's going to be implemented. You can have a really low upfront implementation cost, but at a killer maintenance or support cost. And without identifying and evaluating both of those components, you won't really have a good insight into what the actual cost of a particular implementation project is. These are some examples for IT projects that go into a little bit more detail. But depending on the solutions you're considering, again, higher upfront costs versus lower maintenance costs could potentially even out with lower upfront costs and higher annual costs, depending on how you evaluate things. There's also the sort of people and change management side of things. There is a cost to change. There's everything from the communication processes and the materials that go along with that, to the actual, potential physical changes of workspaces and, other kinds of equipment that might be required. So, thinking through all of those different ways that an organization could incur costs and evaluating your alternatives against all of them is really important. The biggest issue that I have seen is the assumption that that there are not maintenance and support costs that are relevant in certain cases. So those being omitted from the evaluation of particular from a particular alternative. And yes, I'm seeing Ed's comment that ongoing maintenance and support for the do nothing scenario is as important as all other alternatives. Absolutely. That's one of the biggest ways we, get to the process, to the point of deciding to do something, right? Is that our ongoing maintenance and support costs are unsustainable or have a upward trajectory that's not feasible for future ongoing support. I'm going to talk about discount rates in a little bit, and that comes into play there too. So at a minimum, implementation costs, ongoing maintenance and support costs, things like people, change management, training, all of that stuff that may incur an actual cost as part of the alternative will need to be evaluated across all alternatives. And I think this is another key point that I'll make now, but also will bring in later. That if you have something that's a critical component to a particular alternative, but isn't so much of a factor in others, going back to our little example about pets, licensing is not really a thing for rabbits, but you still want to mention that as a potential cost and evaluate that across all alternatives, not just omit it. So, if licensing is a thing that we're worried about for one of all our alternatives, then we want to look at it across all alternatives, even if that is a $0 cost for some of them. Benefits is the next kind of component of this. Benefits are the outcomes that the organization can expect to achieve as a result of addressing the problem or opportunity that was identified in the business case. So very similar to the benefit side of cost-benefit analysis, where we're looking at the different ways that we may realize benefits. The difference here is that we're not necessarily required to quantify those benefits in terms of dollars. They can be in terms of things like hours of work saved or number of constituents served, or other kinds of measurements of benefits. So, many of those things can be potentially quantified in dollars, and if cost-benefit analysis is a component of a business case that would be important for your organization, it might make sense to take that step. But if it's not, and if you're looking at, potentially, using the resources you have in-house to do the best kind of analysis that you're capable of doing right now. And that does not include a study to quantify those kinds of things in dollars. Totally fine to find other ways to create measurements and understand the benefits across the alternatives. So, again, this goes back to the goals that are identified early on in the business case, the things that the organization is trying to achieve by addressing the problem or opportunity. So you should have the ability to look at the earlier components of the business case and those processes to identify those kinds of goals and opportunities, to identify criterion that would make sense to use in the context of benefits for your alternatives analysis. The biggest thing that I see with the benefits criteria for alternatives analyses are that there are common organizational goals that are not sufficiently translated into what they specifically mean for an organization. So things like accessibility and equity and simplicity and ease of use very commonly are things that organizations are trying to achieve through a particular initiative. However, those all mean different things to different people, and sometimes different things to the same person, depending on the day and how they're feeling and all of that. So one of the big components of this type of criteria is to make sure that you are identifying exactly what is meant by it. So when we're talking about accessibility for whom, measured how, and using what kinds of tools, methods, processes to determine what that accessibility means. And there are many ways that can be done, but the benefit of accessibility is in and of itself not specific enough to really convey what someone's trying to measure or articulate through a business case. So just keep that in mind, that common organizational goals make great benefits, but you've got to define your terms so that we all know what they mean. And then getting a little bit more into risks, identifying risks is really critical. Risks can be related to the whole project or program, or potentially the organization as a whole. I think this is one of the areas where having specific project or program risks makes the most sense. In the same way that there are certain benefits that the organization might achieve through a particular initiative that may align with organizational goals, but they may also be goals of the project in and of itself. So an example of a project or program risk is maybe, for example, a specific program may have legacy systems that a new system or technology must integrate with, and there are risks associated with that type of integration that may be specific to the program situation. Otherwise, things like elections, since most of us are in the public sector, the impact of elections can be outsized depending on what happens and what all is included on the ballot that election cycle. So things like leadership changes, particular measures or ballot initiatives that may impact the way that government functions, all of those kinds of things can have an organizational risk related to the particular initiative that's being identified and addressed through the alternatives analysis. In general, what I've seen is that the status quo alternative usually has higher risks related to legal compliance, security issues, liability, things like that. Most of those things are what contributes to the business case being started in the first place. So, the identification of a problem usually has a set of risks associated with it that are by nature part of the status quo. So, especially if you're looking for risks, things that you're hoping to avoid or improve through the tackling of this particular initiative, that's a good place to start when looking for risks to evaluate across your alternatives. So let me go back real quick. The one that we didn't talk about here is the minimum requirements to address the problem or opportunity. Again, those are usually identified as part of the description and discussion of the problem or opportunity earlier in the business case. So definitely including those requirements and the ability of alternatives to address those requirements is a really important part of the business case and should be part of the criteria that you use to evaluate the alternatives as well. So if we have cost, benefit, risks, and our requirements, there are many ways to go about actually collecting and analyzing data related to these criteria. And I'm going to start with quantitative data because I think this is what most people think about, in part because business cases tend to rely pretty heavily on cost-benefit analysis type principles for a lot of their evaluation processes. So with quantitative data, we're talking about measurements in the form usually of numbers, sometimes in the form of currency, but we're talking about defining measurements and processes up front that can be applied consistently throughout the application to, look at how we construct measurements and use those measurements within the business case. One of the two of the big things that I see happening with quantitative analysis, especially within the public sector, is the tendency to rely on things like indicators and indexes, in part because we are looking at a lot of things that don't necessarily have direct measurement, like citizen satisfaction with government services, or trust in government, things like that we can't simply take out a ruler and measure. So with indicators and indices, I think the most important thing is to remember to make a specific decision that is based on some sort of evidence or a clear logical argument as to why that indicator or index is appropriate for the thing that you're trying to measure. Especially with indexes, there's a tendency to rely on a well-known index without necessarily considering, from a critical perspective, what goes into that index and how it's calculated. Maybe that makes perfect sense for, what you're trying to use, but in some cases, there are different weights to various parts of indexes. Maybe those don't make sense or don't align with the organization's, mission, vision, and values. Those are things to consider before just accepting an index and having that be the measurement of a particular criterion that you're using. And then same thing with indicators. If we can't measure something directly, what can get us closest to an approximation of that measure? And how do we articulate that that's the thing that we have decided is the closest approximation? So, really thinking about those things and not just accepting, what's been used in the past. Maybe now is the time to look at other ways of measurements that that might make sense to evaluate a criterion. You never know when something is going to progress to allow us to have different ways to look at what we're trying to measure. And then projections and forecasts are super fun. So especially for those of you that might be economics nerds like me, I love a good regression analysis that projects into the future what we know about today. So, using projections and forecasts can be really powerful tools that give us some insight into what we can expect based on what we currently know. I think the biggest tip that I have for folks that are interested in using those kinds of quantitative tools, though, is to make sure that you can explain the process to someone that's never heard of it before. I've been in many presentations about studies where someone's trying to explain a very complicated forecast and is maybe not super well versed in all the different nuances of statistical analysis. If you can't and you're not comfortable with that kind of explanation, maybe consider simplifying the types of analysis that you're doing, or finding resources, finding statisticians or economists to help you with those sorts of tools and analytical processes, to make sure that everyone's very clear on exactly what the process is and exactly how we arrived at the particular projections or forecasts that are being used to evaluate your alternatives. There are many tools out there that will help with projections and forecasts in particular. One of the things that is nice is how prevalent some of our statistical tools are now. I'm sure a lot of you are either users of Power BI or languages like R or Python, or perhaps those super Excel power users that can do all kinds of projections and forecasts just using Excel. We have a lot of tools at our disposal. With those tools and the complexity that they bring comes the risk of having a downstream equation error impact the projection or forecast that we're using. So just making sure that we're all being really careful and critical of the complex quantitative tools that may be at our disposal. Definitely use them if you're comfortable with them, but make sure that you're well versed in exactly the application that you're providing. I think qualitative data doesn't get as much credit as it should, especially in business cases. There is a wealth of data out there that doesn't necessarily conform to the quantitative data that I think is viewed as more rigorous. I'll just full disclosure, my PhD uses qualitative methods, so I'm very much a qualitative method person. So perhaps a little bit of bias there, maybe not as much as towards rabbits, but that's where I'm coming from. I think that qualitative data can be a very powerful tool so long as it's used appropriately and used as rigorously as quantitative data is. So some of the critical components with this are, again, defining your process and methodology up front. Just like there are many different ways that you can use quantitative data to do your evaluation and make your recommendation, there are as many different ways to use qualitative data as well. I think the commonality across all the qualitative methods that I'm familiar with, at least, is the creation of a guide to data collection processes up front. So define what you're going to do, what counts as data, how you're going to collect that data, what the intention is as far as analysis goes, even if it's not appropriate for the method that you're using, to fully define that evaluation method up front. So some of the tools and things that we use that you're probably most familiar with are things like interviews and focus groups, sometimes open-ended survey questions. Those are all great examples of qualitative data. There are other methods too, though, that might be appropriate depending on what kind of data you're trying to collect and what you think is the most applicable for the criteria you're trying to measure. So things like ethnographic studies, the sort of job shadowing, the thematic analysis of documentation, all those kinds of things fit into this qualitative data sort of category. So when applicable, you want to create and test a data collection instrument. If you're doing an interview, a focus group, I think for those of you who were at the last Bang meeting, I think it was, where we split into kind of focus groups and talked about Bang activities. The Bang team members were using a interview guide as part of that. That's the kind of data collection instrument that would be appropriate to test, to create and test ahead of time as well, not just a survey or something that's being distributed for use with your potential respondents. So, this is not just about the surveys, emails, communications that might be part of your data collection method. It's also about the tools that you as the data collector intend to use. And then the most important part of qualitative data is the processing of that data. So, this is not just about getting a whole bunch of survey responses and pulling out quotes that we like. This is about actually doing a rigorous coding process going through that data in a way that applies some of the principles of kind of social science to that data, to pull out key themes, or to code the responses and the notes that you've taken in particular ways. But identifying the ways that you know that those codes or themes are appropriate in a coding manual is a key component of rigorous qualitative data analysis. So you should, at the end, not just have your processed data, but also have something that shows someone who maybe wants to follow along through your original data set, how you arrived at the decision that that sentence in the second interview from your third day of interviews really meant the particular code, or was really part of the particular theme that you assigned it to. And then I think also there's a tendency, especially for those of us that are in smaller agencies or organizations, that maybe don't have the ability to have a whole fleet of business analysts at our disposal. But there's a tendency to have one person sort of do the analysis and go with it. Just like you would have someone look over a spreadsheet that has complex mathematical equations in it. Also consider having someone do cross-coding to increase the validity of the codes that you're assigning to the qualitative data that you've collected. That just means having someone else use your coding manual to go through some or all of your data set and comparing the codes that you and another person have assigned to the same data to see how similar they are. If they're not, then that's either an opportunity to improve your coding manual, or to have a discussion and potentially bring in a third set of eyes to take a look at the codes that are being applied if there are truly different interpretations of the same qualitative data. So just like with quantitative data, the big tip here is ensure you can explain the process to someone that's never heard of it before. If you're going to start down the path of ethnographic research, this is the time to be able to explain exactly what ethnography is, and how you're going to use a variety of qualitative methods to achieve the goals of your data collection through that particular methodology. And if you can't, consider finding resources that are well versed in the methodology you're intending to use. Put our sociology majors to work. Get a lot of folks that are well versed in qualitative methods out there that can be part of these sorts of studies, these sorts of data collection efforts. There are qualitative researchers all over the place that have those skills. And then, the second biggest tip is that qualitative data is not code for anecdotal evidence. So, I've seen that be the tendency to think that qualitative data is mostly used as the sort of quote that is explaining the quantitative data that is the real data. Qualitative data is real data and can have as much power as quantitative data does. So just make sure that we're applying the same rigorous methods to qualitative data that you would to quantitative methods. And the discussion of whether to go qualitative or quantitative or some mix of both, which is also a wholly different field, the sort of quant-qual analysis or mixed methods approaches. Really the decision is about what will meet the needs of your organization. There are organizations that have to have members. Their decision makers can't function in the sort of qualitative space and without being able to see a sort of a numerical analysis of the alternatives that are being considered against each other. It's going to be really difficult for them to get to a decision. There are other organizations that live and breathe qualitative data and have a really hard time with simplifying things down into a particular set of numbers. It all depends on what your organization's approach to these kinds of decisions is, and what's going to be most understood and respected by your decision makers. Going into a heavy quantitative space with a set of focus group findings and a thematic analysis, probably not going to carry as much weight as having a well-documented set of decisions around measurements in the form of indicators or indices to use, and mapping those out for each alternative. I think especially with quantitative data, there's a tendency to fall into the certainty trap, and to try and get to specific numbers as quickly as possible, even if the rest of our business case, the rest of our decision making, doesn't necessarily warrant that level of certainty yet. If you're still at the sort of plus or minus 50% about what the problem or opportunity even is that we're trying to solve, giving us, a cost-benefit analysis down to a number of cents is not the level of certainty that you should be at that point. So, one of the things that we can do with business cases is continually revise business cases as we have more information and as we continue along the sort of project process. Different types of data may make sense at different points in the business case. Perhaps a set of interviews with key stakeholders at an early stage might make sense, whereas the quantitative data that we can get out of a set of pilots at a later stage would make sense for the same criterion. So mixing and matching data types, especially as you're continuing along the business case or project process, can be really powerful and prevent you from getting into a position where you're making quantitative measurements that have a level of certainty that we're just not at yet. And then I think also really critical is engaging stakeholders early, often, frequently, and making sure that they're involved in the criteria definition process as well, not just the alternatives analysis, the alternatives evaluation process. So, we're not just interviewing stakeholders about what they think are viable, alternatives for a problem or opportunity, and which one of the alternatives they prefer, but also, including them in the decision about what's important to consider when looking at alternatives in the first place. And I'm realizing now that most of this is actually about just choosing criteria and deciding how to measure them. But honestly, that's really the crux of the evaluation. With business cases, we're looking at each alternative against a set of criteria, and at the very end, bringing it all together and saying, okay, now that we've identified and evaluated all of these alternatives against the same set of criteria, which one do we choose? So this assumes that we've collected our data and that we've identified our criteria, collected our data, and evaluated each alternative kind of individually. Some of the different things that then need to go into play is, how do we actually measure and rank our alternatives' ability to meet criterion? There are three different ways in general. First is using continuous scales. So this is taking our pure measurements that we are using. This is about identifying, a particular measurement for each alternative against each criteria. So a number of dollars, percentage of whatever it is that we're trying to evaluate, the account of something. Those are all examples of continuous ranking options. We also have two different ordinal options where we ascribe a particular number to a measurement. So we can either do objective or relative ordinal rankings. Objective ordinal is, again, identifying a scale and saying how an alternative measures against that scale, whereas ordinal relative ranking is about saying, okay, we have 3 or 5 alternatives, and here is a scale that we're going to use to rank them essentially against each other. So in this particular criterion, this one is best, worst, somewhere in the middle. That's what we're looking at for a relative ordinal scale. So, this is kind of the modeling side of things. there are different ways to approach these. I will say that continuous ranking is difficult when you don't measure all of your alternatives in a consistent way. So continuous ranking is a lot easier with things like cost benefit analysis, where everything's being put in terms of dollars. You could also do a continuous ranking where everything's being put in terms of number of clients served or impacted. All of those options are ways that you could get to a continuous ranking that allows you to rank across criteria and not just in a single criteria. And then, so we have the different ways that we come up with measuring our ability to, for an alternative to meet each criterion. We then have to put those together in a particular model. So that model takes all of your criteria and says, here's how all of these things fit together and how they all are related to each other. There are generally two different ways to do this. The one is to have everything be equal. So for relative ordinal criteria or objective ordinal criteria, that's pretty easy, right? For relative ordinal, this just means that everything gets a 1, 2, or 3 if it's a 3 alternative scale. If it's a 5 alternative scale, it's a 1 to 5, and they're all equal. With objective ordinal, if we assign 10-point scales to everything, everything is up to 10 points. With weighted criteria, we can identify which of the different criterion maybe have more importance to our organization, either because stakeholders value them more, there's more alignment with mission, vision, and values. There are many different reasons that you might want to weight something. But essentially what we would do with weighting is say, for our objective ordinal scale of 1 to 10, for example, yes, everything gets a 1 to 10 ranking, but this side is multiplied by 10, or this side is worth 10% of the overall points. This side over here is worth 50%, or multiplied by 50. Being able to identify which things are more important when evaluating all of the criteria together is a really critical part of deciding to weight your criteria. And this is one of those places where you'd want to have a good logical reasoning behind doing the sort of weighting that would be required to make this work. So that logical reasoning can be grounded in the background research, the mission, vision, values, the strategic alignment, the requirements to meet mandates, those sorts of things. My caution against weighting, or not against, but my caution with weighting is that if you have anything that's a deal breaker, that's more of a binary, yes, it must be there, or no, it's not acceptable, to build those into your assumptions and constraints, or to have those be factors in the alternatives that you choose to evaluate, rather than trying to give something all of the points in your weighting and diminishing everything else. If it's a true binary that is a full stop, cannot move forward unless something exists, it probably makes more sense as a factor in your alternatives identification, rather than the criteria that you're using to evaluate alternatives. Continuous criteria are very difficult to include in full models because they are so different. How does $1 billion relate to 2 lives saved, to increase in trust in government by 50%? It's really difficult to take those things and reconcile them with each other. So my suggestion is generally, if you're not going to use a consistent set of measurements for your continuous criteria, to consider moving to a relative or objective ordinal scale instead when doing your full model of your analysis. So it would definitely make sense to, keep the, total budget of $1 billion versus 500 million for another alternative, but maybe shifting those into some sort of objective or relative ordinal scale, rather than keeping those as pure dollar values, to help with things like identifying, how many constituents we can impact, which would definitely not be in the realm of billions of people in most government contexts. So if we go back to our, again, admittedly a little bit lacking business case example, we have our status quo, our dog, cat, and rabbit options, and maybe doing a little bit better job of identifying some criteria, evaluating them, and in this case, using a relative ordinal scale, so a scale of 1 to 4, with no options for repeating measurements here. We have identified a little bit better criterion to use for our problem or opportunity, and that is to relieve loneliness. Our costs include licensing here. Our acute quotient has been applied to all of our different alternatives. The risk is having to deal with litter boxes. I think that's a big risk. And just to appease those of you who mentioned that the stakeholder group was a little bit suspect, I also asked the other people that live in my house and not just me. So we expanded our stakeholder group a little bit. And using that relative ordinal scale of 1 to 4, evaluated each of these options by having an interview with the folks that live with me. And again, we have our scores here. Cats, just not our thing, but rabbits came out on top with a score of 12. One of the things that this does show is that there is there's a little bit of a difference between our 4th alternative versus our 3rd alternative here. So that's the kind of thing that you can get at with your numerical evaluations as well, is the scale of difference between the different alternatives that you've identified and evaluated. So just a small attempt to make that a little bit better. And just to reiterate, rabbits are awesome, so that is the alternative we chose. That's all I've got for you all today. Thanks for listening and hanging in there with me. Last time I said stay warm at the end because we were in the middle of an ice storm. Today I'll say stay cool because we're in the middle of a heat wave. So, again, I really appreciate the opportunity to come hang out with you all and talk a little bit about business cases and alternatives identification and analysis. And I am happy to take any questions or facilitate any discussion that anyone would like to have about anything, especially if it includes why you should have a rabbit as a pet.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm just glad my wife wasn't watching because she keeps bugging me to get us rabbits. So do not send that score sheet to her, please. All right, well, it is only 4 o'clock, so we have plenty of time. If anybody has any questions on the business case content, try to stay away from all of the pet comments that I know everybody wants to put in the chat or unmute themselves and talk about, but anything about the business case content that Rebecca talked about today, any questions? Rebecca, there is a question in there about templates for business cases.
Yes, so I don't personally have a template, in part because I found that most organizations that require formal business cases have their own template, or are in need of a template that is, going to meet their specific needs. So for the state of Oregon, I would suggest, if you're looking at IT stuff, to take a look at the business case template put together by Enterprise Information Services. Otherwise, Infotech, if you have access to them, they have some great templates for business cases that are more t-shirt sized in terms of formality and length. So that's definitely a place that I would take a look at. And then in general, there's some great research, especially coming out of the Harvard Business Review, about the process of business cases in general. So I would suggest looking more at the documents and research that goes into the process of the business case rather than the document template itself. So I think there are a couple of resources that I referenced in both this presentation and the last one that I gave that have some, kind of good starting places for what makes a good business case process and how you might document the outcomes of those particular parts of that process.
Awesome. Hopefully that answered your question, Gilberto. I think it did. Another question in there from Christy. Rebecca, do you see that one?
Yes, management is in the process of attempting to define a template for build versus buy alternatives. Do you have suggestions? Yeah, so if there are critical components to that conversation that happen regardless of the particular thing that is going to be built or bought, getting some alignment around those decision points that are kind of the same across your alternatives, or sorry, across your business cases, would be a really good place to start. So, the kinds of things that typically come up in those sorts of conversations are things like the, presence of in-house expertise, the, ability to maintain infrastructure to support in-house or built alternative, the, kinds of resources required to both maintain and operate. So getting some alignment around what those key decision points are and kind of, constructing that model ahead of time to the best that you can, with the understanding that there are always going to be some, specific criterion that are going to come up as part of an individual build buy decision. One of the assignments that I just gave to my students this quarter is to construct a general model for an organization that might be going through any business case process in the future. And those sorts of high-level discussions about what's important to the organization ahead of time can be really helpful because so often we get caught up in the specific decision we're trying to make and the very particular details that go along with the particular situation that we're in. So anything that can happen as more of a sort of high level, in general, what do we care about kind of discussion ahead of time, I think would be helpful for at least getting to a point where you can maybe not so much have a template, but at least start defining that model for decision making for that particular kind of decision.
Awesome. Thank you. And Christy, hopefully that answered your question. Awesome. It did. All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So thank you again, Rebecca, for coming back for part 2. I don't know if there will be a part 3 in our future or not, but if there is, we will definitely let everybody know through newsletter and other email communication if we bring Rebecca back for a part 3. As far as a farewell for today's forum, October 18th will be our next forum, and we have yet to determine a presenter or a topic. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we really need all of the community's help in finding speakers and topics for these forums. It will also benefit by getting your help so that you have a little bit more stake in what those topics are. So if you have some in mind that you'd really like to hear, please contact us. Again, there's our email at the bottom of that slide. Oh, and actually I need to fix that slide because it's at das.oregon.gov. So I'll put that email address in the chat again for you, and I will fix it on the slide for next time. And our website is also up there. Another reminder there, we will be posting a PDF of Rebecca's slides on the website, and then once I have the recording and the transcript from the recording today to create the closed captions, we will post the link to the YouTube video. Almost all of our forums get recorded and go up on our YouTube channel, so you could always get up there and check out part 1 from Rebecca again and part 2. So if you have a business case coming up but you haven't started yet, it might be good to watch those videos as a refresher. So some shameless plugs there for our YouTube channel and our webpage. So please email us. And as Rebecca said, stay cool. I know I'm about to leave my air-conditioned home and go out and get some shopping done this evening. So I'm not going to stay cool, but once I'm home, I will. So I hope everyone else is able to stay cool, and we will see you again in October.